So our final guest this evening is a former Wall Street Journal reporter and the New York Times best-selling author of 4 books, Luckiest Man, Opening Day, Get Capone, and most recently, The Birth of the Pill. This is where this all comes back around. Ken Burns has called him a master storyteller, and the Washington Post described The Birth of the Pill as a gripping tale and essential reading. Please welcome to Tuesday Funk, Jonathan Eig.
Thank you so much. It's nice to be here. I want to thank Andrew and Eden for inviting me, but I also want to say, why do I have to go last after all that? After the badass who truly was, and stories like sisters chopping up body parts and fairies. It's tough to read a work of nonfiction, and all I can say on my defense is that it's true. I apologize for that. But I'm going to just read from the opening of this book. It takes place in the winter of 1950 in Manhattan. She was an old woman who loved sex, and she had spent 40 years seeking a way to make it better. Though her red hair had gone gray and her heart was failing, she had not given up. Her desire, she said, was as strong and simple as ever. She wanted a scientific method of birth control, something magical that would permit a woman to have sex as often as she liked without becoming pregnant. It struck her as a reasonable wish, yet through the years one scientist after another had told her no, it couldn't be done. Now her time was running out, which is why she had come to an apartment high above Park Avenue to meet a man who was possibly her last hope. The woman was Margaret Sanger, one of the legendary crusaders of the 20th century. The man was Gregory Goodwin Pincus, a scientist with a genius IQ and a dubious reputation. Pincus was 47 years old, 5 feet 10.5 inches tall, with a bristly mustache and graying hair that shot from his head in every direction. He looked like a cross between Albert Einstein and Groucho Marx. He would speed into a room, working a viceroy between his yellowed fingers, and people would huddle close to hear what he had to say. He wasn't famous, he owned no scientific prizes, no world-changing inventions were filed under his name. In fact, for a long stretch of his career, he'd been an outcast from the scientific establishment, rejected as a radical by Harvard, humiliated in the press, and left with no choice but to conduct his varied and oftentimes controversial experiments in a converted garage. Yet he radiated confidence, as if he knew the world would one day recognize his brilliance. Pincus was a biologist, and perhaps the world's leading expert in mammalian reproduction. In the 1930s, at the start of his professional career, he'd attempted to breed rabbits in petri dishes, using much the same technology that decades later would lead to in vitro fertilization for humans. Then he was young and handsome and possessed of a limitless imagination. He posed for newspaper photographs and boasted to reporters that a new age of human reproduction was on the horizon, one in which men and women soon would employ modern methods to control the process of making babies. Science would lead the way. But Americans were not ready to hear such things. The press compared him to Victor Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's fictional scientist who tried to conjure life but accidentally created a monster. Harvard denied Pincus tenure, and no other university would hire him. He was deemed too dangerous. At that point, a more humble man might have chosen a new line of work. A weaker man might have succumbed to anger or despair, but not Goody, as his friends and family called him, as much for his friendly nature as his middle name. For while Pincus was affectionate and disarming in social settings, when it came to his career, he was, as one colleague put it, a street-fighting Jew. Getting knocked down was merely the thing that happened before Pincus got up to fight again. When Harvard dumped him and no other job offers arrived, he moved to Worcester, Massachusetts, a factory town, where a former colleague from Harvard had offered him a low-paying, low-ranking position as a researcher for Clark University. He worked in a basement lab where dust from a nearby coal bin contaminated his experiments. When he asked the university to provide him a proper laboratory, the request was denied. Again, he might have quit. Instead, Pincus and one of his colleagues did something unprecedented. They launched their own scientific research center. They went door to door in Worcester and in the surrounding area, distributing brochures and asking housewives, plumbers, and hardware store owners to contribute, no donation too small, to a new institution they called the Worcester Foundation for Experimental Biology. With the money they scraped together, they bought an old house in nearby Shrewsbury, where Pincus set up his office and lab in the garage. The operation was so lean in those early years that he cleaned his own animal cages, and at one even lower moment, moved his wife and children into a state-run insane asylum while conducting research there on schizophrenia. Pincus knew about Sanger. Almost everyone in America did. It was Sanger who had popularized the term birth control and almost single-handedly launched the movement for contraceptive rights in the United States. Women would never gain equality, she had argued, until they were freed from sexual servitude. Sanger had opened the nation's first birth control clinic in Brooklyn in 1916 and helped launch dozens more around the world. But even after decades of work, the contraceptive devices available at those clinics, condoms and cervical caps mostly, remained ineffective, impractical, or difficult to obtain. It was as if she'd been teaching starving people about nutrition without giving them anything healthy to eat. Sanger explained to Pincus that she was looking for an inexpensive, easy-to-use, and completely foolproof method of contraception, preferably a pill. It should be something biological, she said. Something a woman could swallow every morning with her orange juice or while brushing her teeth, with or without the consent of the man with whom she was sleeping. Something that would make sexual intercourse spontaneous, with no forethought or messy fumbling, no sacrifice of pleasure, something that would not affect a woman's fertility if she wished to have children later in life, something that would work everywhere from the slums of New York to the jungles of Southeast Asia, something 100% effective. Could it be done? The other scientists she'd approached, every one of them had said no, and they'd given her a long list of reasons. It was dirty, disreputable work. The technology wasn't there. And even if it somehow could be done, there would be no point. 30 states and the federal government still had anti-birth control laws on the books. Why go to the trouble of making a pill no drug company would dare to manufacture, and no doctor would dare prescribe? But Sanger held out hope that Gregory Pincus was different, that he might be bold enough or desperate enough to try. It was the midpoint of the century. Scientists were taking up matters of life and death that once had been the domain principally of artists and philosophers. Men in lab coats, and yes, they were almost all men, were heroes, winners of wars, battlers of disease, givers of life. Malaria, tuberculosis, and syphilis were among the many illnesses surrendering to modern medicine. Governments and giant corporations poured unprecedented sums of money into research, sponsoring everything from high school science clubs to cold fusion exploration. Health became a political issue as well as a social one. World War II had scarred the earth but also transformed it, offering the promise of a better, freer world, and scientists were leading the way. Americans were settling into new suburban box homes and exploring the joys of lawn care, dry martinis, and I Love Lucy. At least to the casual observer, the United States in the 1950s appeared to be staid and steadfast. The Andrews sisters sang I Want to Be Loved, and John Wayne starred in The Sands of Iwo Jima, celebrating the nation's military might and commitment to democratic ideals. It was a glorious time to be an American. Young men returning from battle were looking for new adventures and new ways to feel like heroes as they adjusted to the dullness of their homes, marriages, and jobs. During the war, new rules of morality had applied. Sex had become a more casual endeavor, as foreign women traded their bodies to American soldiers for cigarettes and cash. Girlfriends back home had written steamy letters filled with promises of the great passion awaiting their men. In truth, many of the women back home had been exploring their own new moral standards. The war had thrust women into the workplace, putting money in their pockets and liberating them from their parental homes. They'd begun dating and making love to men they did not intend to marry, experimenting with new ideas about intimacy and commitment. In 1948, a college professor in Indiana named Alfred Charles Kinsey published a study called Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, to be followed 5 years later by Sexual Behavior in the Human Female, and found that people were much friskier than they cared to admit. With 85% confessing to premarital sex, 50% acknowledging extramarital affairs, and almost everyone saying they masturbated. It would turn out that Kinsey was perhaps biased in his conclusions, but the impact of his work was profound. In 1949, Hugh Hefner, a graduate student in sociology at Northwestern University, read Kinsey's report and wrote a term paper arguing for an end to the repression of sex and sexuality in America. Let us see if we cannot begin to find our way out of this dark, emotional, taboo-ridden labyrinth and into the fresh air and light of reason, Hefner wrote, as he began preparing to do something about it personally. Late one winter night in Manhattan, Margaret Sanger met Gregory Pincus to talk about nothing less than a revolution. No guns or bombs would be involved, only sex, the more the better. Sex without marriage, sex without children, sex redesigned, re-engineered, made safe, made limitless for the pleasure of women. Sex for the pleasure of women? To many, that idea was as unthinkable in 1950 as putting a man on the moon or playing baseball on plastic grass. Worse, it was dangerous. What would happen to the institutions of marriage and family? What would happen to love? If women had the power to control their own bodies, if they had the ability to choose when and whether they got pregnant, what would they want next? 2,000 years of Christianity and 300 years of American Puritanism would come undone in an explosion of uncontrollable desire. Marriage vows would lose their meaning. The rules and roles of gender would be revocable. Science would do what the law had so far not. It would give women the chance to become equal partners with men. This was the technology Sanger had been seeking all her life. So, in a sleek Park Avenue apartment where long threads of cigarette smoke floated toward the ceiling, Sanger gazed across a coffee table at Pincus and made her pitch. She was 71 years old. She needed this. So did he. "Do you think that it would be possible?" she asked. "I think so," Pincus said. "It would require a good deal of research," he added, "but yes, it was possible." Sanger had been waiting much of her life to hear those words. "Well," she said, "then start right away." Thank you.